99X, it's Barnes and Leslie talking true crime. Our guest right now is Mike Petchenik, who spent 12 years at Channel 2 on the air, covering all types of things from true crime and beyond. He's got a new book. He's got a website called trialwatchers.com with Neil Gordon, and it's many things. They've got a Patreon now. They've got a podcast they're working on, a docuseries. So there's a lot going on. If true crime interests you, I would pop by and check out trialwatchers.com.
Barnes brought this up a second ago, Mike, about how sometimes we glamorize these people. The fact that we are still doing documentaries and shows on Jeffrey Dahmer after all these years, and that, he was this good-looking guy. What do you think that is?
I think people are looking for that sort of cult of personality, and it doesn't matter if it's evil or if it's good. And I think a lot of people get into these cases and become enamored by the characters, like Jeffrey Dahmer, for example. Modern day examples, there's a guy who was just convicted of murdering 2 women down in Florida. Some people call him the Deadpool killer, if you heard of that case. But he, pretty good looking guy. He's got a lot of face tattoos. But women apparently have fallen in love with this guy, and they're sending him jail mail and trying to, become his girlfriend. And so,
unbelievable.
Yeah, you just see a lot of this stuff. It's pretty crazy.
But that's almost the parallel I mentioned earlier about rock stars. It's like these true crime personas, these people become rock stars to a different type of community. I mean, not as extreme as you're saying, like the people who will, write in and want to marry the person even and marry them, to just us, like regular people who live in the neighborhood who a big crime happened, nearby. One that happened in my neighborhood was the big trial where the judge was shot here in Atlanta. This goes back like 15, 20 years probably. But what was his name? They did a movie. Brian Nichols. That house, I do my own little true crime tour. When friends come to town, I'll take them by and go, this is the house where this poor guy, this federal agent, was ambushed. And then I'll drive him up to the MARTA and go, look, there's MARTA. That's where he got off. And even with the Dunwoody daycare, you can easily look up the address where Andrea Snyderman and Rusty Snyderman were living. I went and did the drive from that house to the Dunwoody daycare and pulled up outside. It just gives you chills. But what is the psychology, Mike, that is behind something like that? What drives us as a community to latch onto this, and even from afar on television?
Well, I would say, Barnes, you're kind of an outlier here because 80% of true crime fans are women.
Really?
So, yeah. And we looked into that. We interviewed a preeminent media psychologist as part of this book in our series. And there are a couple of reasons why. Number one, women in general are much more empathetic than men. They just have the capacity to care for the crime victims. In some cases, the crime perpetrators more so than men. They're very principled. They want to see the good guy prevail and the bad guy go to prison.
80%.
80%, yeah, and that's backed up by network executives who say that those are the demographic, the consumers of these podcasts, documentaries, and things like that. And the other thing is women, and maybe Leslie, chime in here. Do you ever follow these cases to learn how to avoid becoming the victim of a crime? Do you watch?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you go down a deep, dark hole. Is that what people do?
They do, yeah. It's sort of a blueprint about not becoming a victim.
I try to get my daughters to watch to say that this stuff happens. It's better that you're aware of it and know the outcome and know maybe how you could avoid it.
Right. And you don't want to go down a rabbit hole and think that the world's just an awful, awful place, but it's a good idea to keep an eye on that stuff.
You brought something up about being empathetic because... Do you remember The Staircase, the Michael Peterson trial?
Oh, yeah.
And I went down a deep, dark hole and watched every single series about The Staircase. Barnes, you and I talked about it.
Absolutely.
Do you think at the end of the day people felt sorry for Michael Peterson?
That's a tough one. I mean, he was a college professor, right, who threw his wife down the stairs, and then there was... Yeah.
And a lot of people were like, did he, didn't he?
Allegedly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I don't know that I felt sorry for him, but there probably were people who did just because that guy went, he was run through the ringer for sure.
But what is it? I still am not finding, and I don't know what the answer is, but like Leslie, who was so engulfed in this, you had no connection to it. Yeah. It was states away.
We talked about it you and I talked about it over and over again.
I guess that it's an everyday thing that could happen. you find whoever at the bottom of the stairs. How did they get there? But the connection points, like even for the Tex MacGyver trial, I had a couple of connections to that, which were super strange. One of them was, I have a company that I do production all over the country and all over the world with drones and VR and stuff like that. Well, Billy Corey, the guy who owns that big Corey Tower, who was a big piece of this trial, had called me out of the blue right before this to come down to meet with him because he wanted to shoot a video about his big smokestack screen, that big LED screen. And I walked in and I met Diane, the woman who was killed, who was shot like a month before it happened. So then all of this stuff happens. And then the whole thing about the massage therapist goes on trial. Was a witness. Do you remember that? And it was very salacious about how could he have this? Well, guess what? That's my massage therapist.
No
that
way.
Same person.
Ooh.
And so I know for a fact, here's this God-loving religious woman who they were implicating, saying that she was involved with this guy. No chance. But it's that kind of weird connection that you don't get unless, you're in that inner circle. But Murdaugh, same way in South Carolina. All these people that know that family. It's so strange.
Mike, I have to ask you about some of the podcasts that actually turn into series. Like, didn't Making a Murderer start as a podcast and then became that huge Netflix series?
Yeah, I believe it did. And those were some investigative journalists who did some really, really groundbreaking work in that Stephen Avery case to get to the bottom of what happened there and sort of ask a lot of very tough questions. And that's a great genre of the true crime world. Serial's another example of a podcast that is working to free people who are wrongly accused or wrongly convicted of things. We're not doing that with Trial Watchers, but we certainly talk about those kinds of cases. I did want to turn the tables on you quickly, both of you.
Yeah.
Have either of you had a trauma in your past life? Have you ever been the victim of a crime or a family member who's been a victim of a crime?
Had an aunt murdered in Mississippi.
Ooh.
What?
Over 20 years ago, maybe going on 30 years.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I wasn't really close to her. My mom has several sisters. This is one that moved away early, and she was murdered in, I don't remember the city in Mississippi. I've tried to look it up, and I found like a little bit about it. But other than that, no. You, Leslie?
No, I haven't. Why, Mike?
Well, the reason I ask is we have found that in some cases people are into true crime because they're trying to resolve an unresolved injustice in their own lives.
I could see that. I could see where that could tie in.
So maybe, Barnes, you're interested in this. Now, was the killer convicted in that case?
I believe so.
Wow.
Okay.
It might have been a domestic violence situation. I don't remember exactly. It's 30 years.
But subconsciously, maybe that's a part of your why.
Or I wanted to be a detective or an FBI agent when I was a kid.
Okay.
And so, I can remember driving down in Atlanta, and we have a lot of choices, of every single bad true crime situation that happened wherever and tell you about it. When I go over on Roswell Road, I remember the ambush at that ATM that used to be in the parking lot where the Goldbergs is. There was a guy who was in the back of a truck. He backed up to it, and when the Brinks car came, they shot. I'm not sure if they killed the guy or not, but robbed him. And it was that little hut, that little ATM hut. And now that thing is gone. But stuff like that just sticks in my mind. Well, your stuff is fascinating. Trialwatchers.com. You can find out all about it. When is the docuseries going to be ready, Mike?
Our first episode is actually going to drop on August 29th on our Patreon
Nice.
page.
Hey, congratulations.
Perfect. All right, Mike Petchenik, you can find out all about it at trialwatchers.com. Thanks for joining us. Great to meet you.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
This is The Morning X. It's 99X.